As the title states, I'm a nurse who works the night shift in the ER. During my time here, I've seen some pretty horrendous stuff. I've been at this job only a year now, and honestly, I'm surprised that I've lasted this long. I suppose the majority of the time it's rather rewarding, saving people, especially kids. But some of the things that I'm about to tell you, and despite how unrealistic it is, it's enough to outweigh that fulfilling feeling enough to make anybody quit for good. I'm used to it now, plus I've only encountered milder stuff compared to my colleagues. But a certain recent event has made me question where I stand. One of the first things I experienced on the job was more bizarre than scary. She wasn't an old woman, but her hefty and stout stature with a few wrinkles here and there inferred a few years of unhealthy legal substance abuse. She came in complaining of pins and needles all over her body. She stated, "It doesn't hurt too bad, but I can't move," and "static is inside of me." Of course, I immediately thought that she was having a stroke. Numbness, tingling, and an inability to communicate properly all pointed to it. A group of more experienced doctors came to run some checks. A few days later, I heard from one of the nurses that the woman had died, but not of a stroke. She had died of organ failure, because all of her organs were as old as an extremely elderly individual, as if someone had put the insides of a 90-year-old inside of a 30-year-old woman. And we're talking every single organ too. The nurse thought that the static sensation the woman was trying to explain was like an increased aging sensation, like growing pains. I laughed, but it still unsettled me. This woman was healthy, no history of drug abuse, alcohol abuse, or smoking. Not that they could find, despite her outward appearance. It was just purely unexplainable, but that's medicine for you. I found it weird that she didn't seem to have any family, but this is a running trend in these inexplicable experiences. None of the patients ever have any family. After that, things became scarier, weirder. A guy came in bleeding from both eye sockets, no eyes present, but complains about stomach pains. Obviously, everybody on the night shift is more concerned about stopping the bleeding from his empty sockets, and when I say bleeding, I mean this guy was absolutely going to die from blood loss if we didn't stop it. He really didn't seem to care about his eyes or notice it, and instead was losing his mind about the pain in his stomach and how that we had to get it out of him. I remember the urgency in our voices telling him how we will sort his stomach out once we stop the bleeding. He starts becoming aggressive, and he was restrained and pulled into an empty room, and the responsibility of keeping this guy alive was no longer in my hands anymore. One of my colleagues, we'll call her A, came out of that room around 45 minutes later, as pale as a sheet, and just says one of the most horrific sentences that I've ever heard at that point. His eyes, they were in his stomach. When she had finally settled down, I pressed her about what exactly had happened in there. Apparently, the guy went totally insane and just ripped into his torso with his bare hands, tearing into his flesh and ruptured his stomach. He died almost instantly. One of the doctors, I won't say who because he could get into real trouble with this, curiously looked into his stomach and found the guy's eyes swimming around in there. This lunatic ate his own eyes. A didn't quit, but a few other nurses did. And like always, the patient had no family. I think that I should mention I don't live in a big city. I work in one of those hospitals that lay in the middle of 3 small towns, and we're very much in the middle of nowhere. We're not exactly the busiest ER department, but we do get a fair share of people who get into accidents on the roads, and so we receive patients from all over the state. Nearly every single one of these horror story patients seems to come from nowhere. We put their name into a database and nothing shows up. The names they give us lead to nowhere. People from the towns don't know them when their obituaries turn up in the paper and ambulances never bring them to the hospital. It's like they walked straight out of dense forest to get here. A told me another story of a patient that really creeped her out. I'll be transcribing that from the voice recording that I managed to take. I believe it's easier to show the raw experience that way. So, it's like 3 a.m. and this woman walks in with an arrow straight through her neck. Obviously, I'm running checks on her to see how the heck she's walking around with an arrow through her neck. How she's literally acting like nothing is wrong. But she doesn't speak. She's smiling at me. All these other doctors rush over trying to figure out what to do, but she's just motionless, staring and grinning at me. She was a Miss... I blanked out the name for privacy reasons. Can't discuss patient information. And she was 37 years old and extremely tall. Like basketball player tall, which made me feel even more on edge. Out of nowhere, staring right at me, she just pulls this arrow straight out of her neck. And her neck snaps and she falls to the ground, still grinning. There's no blood, as though the arrow was some built-in support to her neck, and removing it would break it. I just can't get her smile out of my mind. It was as if she was taunting me, like something that wasn't human, as if she knew exactly how to get under my skin. That's all that I've got for now, but I'll try to keep you guys updated with more stuff that I hear about or remember. I was on the night shift last night, and I asked some of the other nurses and doctors to find out if anybody else had experienced anything strange, and the responses were, for lack of a better word, disturbing. One of the nurses, let's call him B, said something that really stuck with me, because I had never given it much thought before. Never seen where the bodies go. I asked him what he had meant by that, because obviously the deceased would be taken to the morgue. Or so I thought. B had been a nurse at the hospital since he had left college, so he had been working at this hospital for a long time, and due to a bad stroke of luck, often during the night shift. I'll be transcribing his story from the recording that he consented to be a part of. Yeah, I've seen a few of those creepy crawly characters come in here. I don't know what they are. They're not human, that's for sure. He paused and shifted uncomfortably in his seat, peering out of the break room's window to ensure that nobody was listening in. You ever notice how their emotions seem false, like they're pretending to be hurt and show pain? That is true for the most part. Most accounts of these odd patients have stated the same thing: lack of real emotion. This one time, a little boy walked in around 9 or so. He looked completely fine to me, so I'm assuming that he's lost because no adults walk in with this kid. It's just him alone in the dead of night. I'm asking him all these questions, if somebody's hurt, where's your mommy and daddy, and so on. This kid just stares up at me with these dead eyes. B coughs, clearly trying to regain composure. He opens his mouth and this huge river of water just falls out, and it keeps on coming out until the whole floor is covered, and it keeps going and going. All the while he's just emptily staring at me like a dead fish. When the water stops, he just collapses and dies. This kid had enough water in him to have drowned 2 horses, I swear. Yet he came into the hospital and was walking around completely fine. He just looked kind of damp. And so we clean him up, and I'm about to take him in the staff elevator to the morgue. But this senior doctor stops me and tells me that we send those kind down by themselves. He said that we don't let nurses or doctors be alone with these strange dead patients that come in on the night shift. Those that have no name, or if they do, can't be found to have any trace. I heard that apparently when the morticians open the elevator door, all they find is an empty bed. If what B said was true, that would add up with A's theory that these patients are not human. But that raises more questions than it answers. If the hospital staff know these things aren't human, why do most of the newer staff have no idea as to what they really are? Why has no one informed us? If the senior doctor in B's story was telling the truth, we can only assume that something terrible happened to a member of staff who was left alone with one of the bodies. But why has this been covered up? And finally, if the bodies are disappearing before they get to the morgue, where do they go? B told me of a doctor who knows a lot about these patients, but he had retired a few months ago. I managed to get his email address from B, so I'm currently trying my best to arrange an interview of some sorts. Another nurse, C, heard that I was compiling these stories and wanted to add her own into the mix, with some added info to it too. I'll be transcribing the story from her perspective in the same manner that I have done thus far. This was my first experience with the patients. Miss C was a senior nurse with graying hair held into a bun. Her thin, slender fingers gripped her scrubs, and I could see that she had a nasty habit of biting the skin around her nails. Anxiety. Honestly, at the time I thought it would be my last. I liked this job too much though, so I managed to get my stuff together and carry on through. This really old guy came in, and I'm telling ya, that old man looked near 90 years old. But this fellow was walking like he was 20 years old, completely fine but in this monotonous tone. He just keeps repeating, "I'm dying, I'm sick," over and over again. I check his vitals and he's completely fine, and so I start to ask him if he's on any medication for his mind or mental state, and if he had forgotten to take them, but he keeps repeating that phrase. I'm losing my patience, and I tell him that he's physically fine and that we just need some cooperation to understand his mental state, and that a team of more experienced doctors will be with us at any minute now. You know, child, I've worked with a lot of elderly patients, so I'm thinking, he's got a terrible UTI. But no, he finally stopped speaking, and now I'm able to really take a look at him, and I realize the guy has no eyelids. Imagine that. Open your eyes really wide and it doesn't stretch over your eyes. That's all the eyelid that you have. This old man suddenly gets up and walks backwards out of the ER front doors, and never taking his eyes off me. He just walks straight out into the night. It was demonic. And she proceeded to tell me that all these patients seemed to only come in between 1 and 3:30 in the morning, from what she had heard. I can validate that the other encounters happened during the same time period. But her story reminded me of another one of my encounters, one that I wish that I hadn't remembered. And this was around Christmas time, one of the busiest times of the year, with how many people desperately try to make it home to their families. I was on my 5th coffee that evening, trying to get through a ridiculously long work shift, after a Christmas Eve party had left me rather hungover. An old woman walked in, but unlike C's elderly patient, mine walked like an elderly woman. She said that she had taken a fall on her knee and that she had found it very difficult to walk on, and that she was in a lot of pain. As a few other nurses went to go fetch her a wheelchair, she kept asking me if I would take her to the bathroom. Usually I would have taken an elderly woman to the bathroom, but when this old lady smiled sweetly at me, I felt all the hairs on my neck stand up, and I felt really scared. I didn't want to be alone with this lady, so I just told her that the other nurses would take her once she was in her wheelchair, so that she wouldn't have to walk. I kept avoiding her gaze, and as I had told her that I personally wouldn't be taking her to the bathroom, I felt an urge to finally look at her. For a split second, I could have sworn that her old wrinkled face had twisted into the most horrific look of anger. You know those really horrible pictures in SpongeBob when the characters freeze into hyper-realistic, disgusting expressions? Well, it was like that. I just have this plastered image in my mind of her wide bloodshot eyes and wrinkled old mouth, pulled into an unrealistically wide frown, with this disturbingly powerful look of hatred and anger. Yet as soon as I had registered it, the sweet little old lady face was back. I was really relieved when the other nursing staff came to look after her, but something just wasn't right about that little old lady. I think back then that I blamed it on the coffee, but now I'm not so sure. A was one of the nurses helping that lady, and she had happened to be on last night's shift, so I asked her what had happened. Apparently the lady was taken to the bathroom by A and another nurse who waited outside, but after she didn't answer to A and the other nurse asked if she was okay, they opened the bathroom door and found that it was empty. I guess her sole purpose that night was to get me alone with her, and I'm glad that she never got the chance. I'll try and update you guys again soon. Luckily, I have another night shift tonight, so I'll aim for tomorrow. I need to find out some answers. Hey everyone, I have so much information that I've been gathering over the past few weeks that I need to share. So here we go. Firstly though, I should mention how one of the senior doctors cornered me during my break a few weeks ago to tell me to not get involved with what's going on. I don't know how he knows, so it seems that I'm going to have to be more wary about my updates. Clearly he knows something, and so my thoughts that there's something seriously twisted and corrupt going on here are feeling more than validated. I'll address a comment posted on my previous update. A user wondered if any nearby hospitals were experiencing the same phenomenon, and so my coworker, C, contacted one of her friends who worked at a hospital a few towns over to ask if they had experienced anything odd concerning patients who were admitted between 1 and 3:30 in the morning. They knew exactly what we were talking about, and they knew a few other hospitals in the state experiencing similar things, so we can assume that it is at least a zonal thing, if not statewide. C's friend also gave us some stories from their hospital that are really weird. I'll be telling the story as we heard it from their perspective. So, my first time encountering these things was last year around Independence Day, when we had this little girl come in. She must have been around 8 or 9 years old. Anyway, she is the cutest thing that you've ever seen, like weirdly, ridiculously cute. Like picture your typical big brown eyes, long lashes, rosy cheeks. You catch my drift. Almost too cute. I find it weird that she's on her own at 2 in the morning, so I asked her if she's lost, if she needs her mommy, and so on. She's just smiling up at me, sweetly, not saying a word. I turned my back to grab a piece of paper for her to write on in case she didn't speak English or something, and as I do, I hear this sickening crunch sound, followed by this horrible squelching noise. It sounded like a wild animal chewing on a carcass. I turn right around and this girl has this huge, stretched out smile revealing massive sharp teeth that just shouldn't be able to fit into her mouth. Her open mouth stank of decaying meat and her brown eyes were red. Still brown but redder, darker. She then growled deeply and got onto all fours like some kind of rabid dog and ran out of the entrance. It was pretty horrific at the time, but now looking back, it's just plain weird. I blamed it on my eyes playing tricks on me until I had heard what had happened to other nurses and doctors on the ward. I called CPS, but I never got a name, so I could only describe a wild child to them that might be in danger or a runaway. C's friend paused for a long time before she finally said this. You know, there's nothing that we can do to stop them. I pressed her on what she meant by this. She continued. They know how to scare us. They know what really gets under each and every one of our skin. The second time that I ever encountered any of these things was around 5 months later. My mom had just died suddenly and I was really hung up about it. I'm a Christian, so I found most of my solace in believing she was happy in heaven, peacefully watching down at me. C's friend began to cry softly on the phone. C and I told her that she'd needed to continue if it had made her too uncomfortable to share, but she relented and continued on. It's around 1:45 a.m. and this really beautiful woman stumbles in. She was a complete mess, her legs all twisted and one of her shoulders definitely dislocated. I rushed to her aid and started asking her what happened and proceeded to try to put her broken bones back in place before it cut off her blood supply. The woman looks at me and she looks just like my mom when she was younger. The same curved up nose, dark hair, almost as if she could have been my mom's cousin or something. She suddenly screams out, "This is my hell," and collapses. I just start sobbing because whatever this thing was, it told me the one thing that had kept me up in spirits after my mom's death was completely false. and that my poor mother was reliving her painful death over and over again. She had died in a car accident and all her limbs were broken on impact. I don't think my mom really is suffering in hell. She was a good Christian woman who lived a good life. What I do think that whatever this thing is, it somehow knew exactly how to destroy me. It knew exactly how to fill me with dread. Something that can know your deepest fears like that, make you vulnerable like that, is not something that we can get rid of. So now we know that somehow these things know our fears, what makes us uncomfortable, or how to get under our skin. I'm just writing down my thoughts, but I wonder if, say, C's friend is right, that those things do know what disturbs us. If that means they know more about us than we do them. If they've been watching us without us realizing. I finally got into contact with that retired doctor, the one that B had told me about. We met up in a coffee shop to discuss the issues in private. I'll be calling him Dr. D from now on for privacy purposes. I asked Dr. D firstly if he had any experiences with the patients. This is what he said. When I first started out that job, everything was fine. We never had any issues with those things before the early 2000s, around 2002 I think. I was around 45 back then, so I had seen a lot of pretty gruesome things already. Just the typical awful road accidents you'd probably know something about. He pours a Jack Daniels miniature into his coffee. There was this one time, this really shocked me. Around 2003 in the spring. Not a massively busy time of the year, and that's the best way that I can put it. Shock. A young woman came in at 3 a.m. She seemed fine, possibly a bit moody at worst, but fine. I ask her what's wrong and she claims that her head is spinning. I ask her what she meant by that and she repeats the phrase again. My head is spinning, doctor. I reach out to get her to put a thermometer in her mouth and her face flashes to one of pure joy. The sickening grin is plastered over her face and her neck starts twisting 360 degrees around like she's some sort of owl, and she drops dead. I'm alone in this checkup room with her and I get this overwhelming sense of dread about the body. Like I just don't want to touch it or go near it. I know as a doctor I should have checked for a pulse, but that woman's twisted neck and grinning face were just so wrong. I stood frozen until that primal sense of fear got too overwhelming and I bolted out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me, and I kid you not. Whatever that thing was, I could hear it scratching at the door handle. I got some other doctors and told them what had happened, and they didn't believe me, and they berated me for leaving a patient and not paging someone. But when we opened that door, she wasn't there. It was around 4 at this point, and in looking for this woman, we had the front doors open and close, meaning whatever it was returning home. After that, the phenomenon grew. Doctors and nurses on the night shift were coming out with these crazy stories of inhuman patients, things who terrified the staff unfortunate enough to work the hours of 1 a.m. to 3:30. And then the attack happened. You might be wondering why we don't leave anybody alone with these things, even on the way down to the morgue. It was more of a statement than a question, so I just nodded. There was this nurse, E, we'll go with that, a super sweet girl, cared a lot about the patients. Well, this teenage boy walked in, his arm bent at an unnatural angle. E rushes him into a room to fix his arm and sends the other nurses to get a splint and bandages. They were only left alone for a couple of minutes. He was struggling to finish the story. He had gone a pale yellow color. I asked him what year it was when this incident took place, and he shook his head. He finally spoke again. 2007. Next thing I hear is this guttural scream from the room, so I run towards it. E is laying on the ground, a mangled and bloodied mess. Her bones had been broken and pierced through her skin, and her bottom jaw was ripped clean off and was stuck in her eye. She was left alone for a few minutes. Just minutes. The window to the room was open, some tiny square thing in the top middle of the wall. It had escaped. I ran outside to see where it had gone, if it had gone, and I see it, this figure running into the woods. It wasn't a teenage boy though anymore. It was some naked, grotesque, humanoid thing. I ran after it screaming. I was just so angry. It got to the edge of the forest and it turned to stare at me. It had these huge, glossy, bloodshot eyes with the black pinhole pupils. It had a wide, lipless mouth stretched over jagged teeth. It was tall with long arms that reached its knees and pale, oily skin. It was horrifying. And then it smiled. It smiled this huge, horrifying smile. Its skin cracking as it was pulled upwards at the corners on each side of its jaw. I saw them. I saw all of them behind it. Shadows, humanoid shadows standing just beyond the tree line. Thousands littering the woods surrounding the hospital. And then it walked into the shadows as they disappeared. There are so many of them. They live in the forest, the woods, the shadows. They pretend to be like us to trap us. They want to kill us to harm us. It's a game to them, a thrill. That's why I left. You can't stop them, none of us can. That was a few years ago now, and I think about it every day. Sometimes I think that I can still see them lurking and waiting for me to give in to curiosity and waltz into those woods. I'm scared that I might. I was shocked. I didn't know what else to say to Dr. D, so I bid him farewell. This was a lot bigger than I thought it was when I had first started writing about this. I felt hesitant about his answers, though. The things that I had experienced were never on par with anything that he had said, and to be honest, seeing an elderly man whose body had long been subjected to years of alcohol abuse talk about such outlandish things led me to be a bit skeptical of his words. Yet there was something unsettling about his eyes. He was traumatized. Dr. D told me to not contact him again, and that he had had enough involvement to begin with. It's been 18 years since the first incident that I can find out about. 13 years since the only death, if we can take the doctor's word as fact. I'm not big on conspiracy theories, so I don't want to get in over my head and assume there's some big cover-up. But with everything that I've collected so far, I can't help but think that there's something seedy happening. Of course, there's always the possibility that people exaggerate their experiences, hyperbole for the sake of storytelling, but I trust my coworkers. I don't think there's smoke without fire, as so to speak. There's a lot of explaining that I need to do, and I'm sure you're all wondering where I've been, what's been happening, and so on. I apologize for not updating as much, but I simply couldn't. I was actually ready to leave my job. Something horrible happened, which I'll explain in a moment, and I just decided to stop playing detective and go find a job as a barista instead. Leave and have a fresh start, and forget that I had ever written about this stuff to begin with. Completely erase it from my memory, act like it had never happened. But I couldn't. I wasn't allowed to. It was only a few weeks after my last post when I saw one of them again. A young man around my age. I didn't realize that he was one of them at first. He walked in normally well, as normally as someone with a gushing head wound would have. He was clutching a motorcycle glove to his head as blood blinded his left eye, and he held his helmet in his free hand. I quickly rushed over to him, ushering for one of the other nurses to grab a wheelchair. He spoke fine, albeit a shaken quality to his voice, and told me how his motorcycle had hit a bump in the road, and that he had fallen and hit his head. I asked him his name, and he said that it was Adam. I know I previously didn't give away patient information, but I don't think that I can really class him as a patient. He had asked for some water and I obliged, filling up a paper cup as he sat down in the wheelchair. The other nurse walking off to grab some paperwork. I handed him his cup, and as I reached into my pocket to grab my paper, he grabbed my chest. I'm a man, so there wasn't even anything to grab, but somehow, he had sunk his nails into my left pec just enough to pull me forward. I opened my mouth to yell out in pain, but he shoved his glove into my mouth and forced me to look into his eyes. They were no longer blue, but entirely black, pupils dilated to an uncanny degree. And in a raspy, pluralized voice, he said, "Don't go looking for things you don't want to know the answer to." I just stared at him aghast. His voice had turned to a myriad of many, all fighting to be heard the most and to be the loudest. There was a malicious frown on his face, but the way that his brows were furrowed, it appeared more like a stern warning than anything truly wishing to harm me any more than they had done already. Like he had tried to mimic a disappointed parent, but didn't quite know how to put his features right. Rage and concern and confusion and disdain merging into one uncanny myriad of emotions, and so I continued to stare until the gravity of the situation took hold. I yelled out for help. Luckily, it was an extremely slow night, so he, the other nurse, and I were the only ones in the lobby. He pulled his nails from my chest and stood up, looming over me. He was suddenly a lot taller than I had registered as he had walked in prior, and he walked out towards these sliding front doors. He stopped, turned back to look at me and the other nurse who was fretting over the puncture wounds that were leaking out onto my scrubs, and suddenly launched his helmet at an almost superhuman speed at the lobby's check-in desk, smashing the glass and slamming the computer with it on the floor. The other nurse screamed in fear, and all I could do was watch in horror as he stared me in the eyes, walking off into the night. That was enough for me to decide to hand in my resignation letter the next day. I had seen firsthand the sheer power those things had. If he had decided to launch my head into the glass instead of his helmet, I would have been reduced to mush. There was no amount of curiosity that needed to be scratched that could come above my desire to live a decent life. So, I had decided my super cool, super interesting monster hunting adventure was over. But I wasn't allowed to leave. When I handed in my resignation letter the next day to the head doctor, he led me into his office. He told me that he needed to make some calls to discuss the termination process, and I obliged. And then he locked me in his office. I began to freak out, trying to use my pager to get A or B to respond and come get me, but no one came. And then a group of people dressed in hospital gear, suits, and smart clothing returned. I couldn't recognize anyone, not even those dressed in scrubs. They all looked at me stoic and unmoving, until a short, plump woman came forward, smiling perkily. She was older than me, but not too old. Around 50 if my memory serves correct. She had tightly curled blonde hair, and had she not been smiling, I would imagine that heavy purpled bags under her eyes would be present, despite the heavy makeup that she wore. She took a seat in front of me, ever smiling, and placed both elbows on the desk, her hands interlinked under her chin. "Well, hello there, my name is X. You seem rather unnerved. I assure you there's nothing to worry about." I don't think I replied. I seemed to just remember looking at everyone but her and how they all stared, unmoving, back at me. "I hear that you're asking to resign." She smiled, trying her best to come across as warm-hearted, but the thumping silence in the room made it futile. She sighed before waving her hand behind her, and the others in the room laughed, albeit hesitantly. I could still see them peering through the glass even after they had departed. "Well, I'm afraid you can't." I asked what she had meant. Surely no one can be forced to keep a job. Well, I was wrong. She pulled a leather briefcase up onto the table from beside her and clicked it open gently, as if any loud noise would send me trembling like a lamb. She must have been more prepared for my response than I was, and more understanding of my reaction too, as if she had done this many times before. She gingerly pulled out a brown file and handed it to me, saying absolutely nothing. I had opened it and immediately shut it again. It was a forged mental health assessment with a referral letter to a psychiatric institution. I looked on in horror back at her, my mouth agape in absolute disbelief at what I was seeing. She continued to smile, the forced sympathy plastered on her face. I began to question why, and then fought to promise how I would keep my mouth quiet, be silent forever. She shook her head. If you were in our position, you would do the same. It's imperative that we keep everything that's been happening here under wraps. She dropped her faux sympathies for a more direct approach, looking me sternly in the eyes. We've been made aware of some posts online. I felt my hands sweat, but I had always been good at lying. Growing up with strict parents helped with that. Don't overreact, that gives it away. Don't try to act too nonchalant. So instead, I just continued to be as bewildered by the situation as before, which wasn't entirely difficult, after being threatened with what was basically psychiatric imprisonment. She seemed to make the assumption that I was not the one posting online, as that smile glossed her lips once more. The hospital will implement more procedures to make sure you feel safe here, but we cannot allow you to leave work. We cannot discuss anything more with you on the matter, but we truly hope that you give us your full cooperation. Are we in agreement on the matter? She asked, a plump finger idly tapping on the file before me, a subtle reminder of what would happen if I withdrew compliance. So I complied. That's why I haven't updated in so long. I didn't want to stay there to keep having to experience what those things were, especially after I had seen the sheer power that they were capable of. But nonetheless, I couldn't help but write some of my experiences and my coworkers in my diary, which I kept tucked under my mattress in my room. I think I should mention that I wasn't the only one who faced a similar ordeal with X and those people. I had whispered to A over coffee if she had been visited, and by family, she seemed to gauge what I had meant and nodded slowly. She had lost sleep over it too. B was the same and had grown ever more gaunt each day that passed. C had left the hospital. Apparently her mother had grown ill and needed care. I doubt the validity of that very much, because I haven't been in contact with her since. Her number was out of service from the moment that I had heard the news. I suppose morbid curiosity must be clawing at you all by now, so I'll satisfy you. During the pandemic, things were pretty slow concerning the things. The emergency room during the day and most evenings were filled with those who desperately needed ventilators, and so we didn't face anything but the horrors of real-life illness and the fear of catching the disease ourselves. Stress and anxiety were at the forefront of our mind, and exhaustion racked our bodies. But the most harrowing part of the whole pandemic was that whenever they came in, we wouldn't even be bothered to react. They would only come in when the ER was empty, and we were waiting for new patients to attend to. To see them trying their hardest to disturb us was almost comical, after seeing so many of our staff and patients be lost to the virus. We also desperately were tired of seeing people die from that, and if one of them came in jerking their body parts around and feigning pain from unnatural accidents, we simply watched them, waiting for them to leave. Sometimes they would make a big spiel, screaming and smashing things in an inhuman manner. Sometimes they would just walk out and leave. And as the pandemic persisted, their appearances diminished more and more. Nothing at that time could have disturbed me more than seeing our beloved janitor G succumb to the illness, unable to be surrounded by any family or friends, as B had to speak Spanish on FaceTime to explain to his family that we were taking him off of life support and to send their prayers and condolences. It was the hardest time that I had ever experienced as a nurse, but the strangest thing was that I was almost thankful to those monsters for at least allowing us to grieve in peace. Once the lockdown was lifted and things began to gain normalcy again, they came back. I hadn't been there for the first sighting around October 2021. A nurse that I hadn't met before, F, who had joined the hospital as a junior nurse straight out of college to help with the pandemic, was working alongside A. A teenage boy had walked into the ER speaking what A recognized as Korean. He kept pointing outside, crying in desperation, grabbing at their wrists to pull them outside. He was hysterical and F immediately rushed forward to help follow him outside. But A held F back, skeptical of the sight before them. F wasn't aware of the things, having joined the hospital when their appearances were near to none. The boy was crying, falling to his knees in a truly dramatic display. F is a compassionate person, but she has far less naivety now than she did then. A pulled out her phone, which we were now allowed to keep on the late-night ER shifts, and used a voice translator to translate what the boy was saying. She could have translated it to her herself, but she didn't want to anger the boy. I won't go into details because it was pretty horrific from what I had heard, but to put it bluntly, the boy repeatedly shouted horrible things and said that he would kill all of her children. When F read it, she sobbed. Once they had looked back up, the boy just grinned at them proudly. He did a bow as if thanking them for watching his performance, and he walked out of these sliding front doors. A had whispered to me on a smoke break that apparently F had grown up with an abusive stepfather for a few years, who would berate her mother when he drank. I suppose reading what the boy had said, I must have triggered something in her. My next experience came soon after. I was alone at the front desk, filling out some admin work on the computer. B was in the bathroom, and I didn't hear the door slides open or anything, but a slow tapping at the glass between me and the waiting room alerted me to its presence. I looked forward until I noticed a small face peering at me from just above the desk. A child. I checked the time and the fact the waiting room was empty and realized one of those things. It was a small, bald child. I had no way of determining its gender, but that was the least of my concern. It had a very large cyst on the top of its head. It stared up at me expectantly as if waiting for me to coo over it. I knew what it was, so for the first time in my life, I ignored a patient opting to sip my coffee and carry on with my work. It clearly didn't like that as it began to slap its small hands against the glass, greasy marks left behind in their wake. I did keep peering at it through my peripheral, but its crumpled, angry face made me snicker. It was like an angry little goblin, and my beyond exhausted state just couldn't take it seriously. That was a bad mistake. It screeched and dropped to the ground, writhing in agony. I stilled. I couldn't see it over the desk anymore, and I was stuck between checking to look at it or continuing to avert all of my focus to the computer. After a few minutes of silence, a large meaty hand slapped the glass, wiping pus and blood all over the screen. I jumped and decided that I had to look. What remained of the small child was a crumpled mess of skin and flesh, one eye popping out from its socket from the pressure of pushing a large muscular arm from its scalp, right where the cyst had once been. The child's tongue lolled out of its mouth and the remaining eye clouded over, as the large hand continued to slap against the glass. It was horrifying, and I began to gag, unfurling the contents of my stomach into the paper bin beside me. The slapping stopped, and I looked up to see nothing. A slow, wet smacking sound bounced around the room, and I shakily looked up over my desk to see the hand pulling itself out of the ER, dragging the crumpled body out behind it, still attached to the bursted flesh atop the child's head. When B came back from the bathroom and with more coffee, he didn't bother to ask me what had happened, just picked up the mop and bucket and cleaned up. And B never asked me about it afterwards. Clearly my green face had told him enough. In late 2022, I had returned the favor, but instead, he told me about his experience. I had gone out for a smoke break, the smoking area around the building not near the ER entrance for patient reasons, and was leisurely strolling through Twitter, headphones in. There was another nurse, H, on staff, so I didn't feel bad leaving him alone. When I walked back into the ER waiting room, I saw H consoling B as he sobbed into a red towel. I purchased an audio recording device off Amazon as I was too scared to use my phone anymore. I've transcribed what he told me. "It's not fair. Why do they do this to us, huh?" He sobs. "Tamika was my friend. Why do they have to remind me of her?" I asked him what he meant. I told him that I didn't think it was good to record him in this state. "No, record me. I'm sick of having to pretend that we aren't being targeted by them." He steadies his breathing. H passes him a glass of water, which he downs. She came in, a woman in her 20s. She looked similar to Tamika, but I knew that it wasn't her. Just somebody who reminded me of her. I checked the time and I knew what was going to happen. I knew and I felt prepared. Well, I wasn't. She didn't complain or say that she felt unwell. I did what I do, you know. I smiled and asked her what was wrong and what her name was. They never react too badly to me, especially when I'm nice. She said nothing, just shaking her head at me, as if I had done something wrong. She handed me this. He shakes the towel before crying again. I tell him that we can stop once more, but he wants to continue. He's crying, but he's more angry than upset. Tamika had cancer, a nursing student with cancer, what irony. He scoffs bitterly. When she got too ill, she had to drop out and go home. I went to visit her when she was in hospice care. She had this red towel and she had asked me to wipe the sweat from her brow, but I couldn't. I couldn't because I couldn't stand how ill this amazing, powerful girl had become. I just cried instead and she comforted me, when I should have been the one to comfort her, and I haven't been able to forgive myself since. I swore that I would graduate and be able to do for others what I couldn't do for her, but that thing has to give me this and then leave. Leave without saying anything. The recording ends there. I've decided not to record anymore. B has gone through a very traumatic ordeal, and I'm sure that Tamika forgives him for not being able to wipe her forehead. But there was an added level of horror that those things were capable of. They were capable of knowing what makes us feel guilt, a psychological concept that I hadn't heard of them capable before. I know that they can revisit trauma as seen with C's friend in F, but never guilt. Those things, those monsters, were trying to break us down as much as possible, more so than I could have imagined. It wasn't just our fears that they knew, but our psyche too. A became cynical. I actually enjoyed our time on the night shift together because she genuinely began to stop caring. She would crack jokes left and right, always making the best out of a bad situation. I suppose I should have seen the signs. Last year, she and I were working together, her behind the desk and the glass and me on coffee duty, or as we had coined it, fodder duty. Being behind the glass meant safety even if those things came close. Only Adam had ever come close to bothering to break it, and so anyone not behind the glass had more of a chance of being targeted. An old man came in, his walker barely keeping him upright. He looked around and saw me and began to ask for a white man instead. He trudged toward A, asking if she would kindly ask for a white man to come help him instead. I shrugged my shoulders and she simply laughed, pointing at the time. 1:02 a.m. Pretty early for one of them, but not unheard of. He began to get irate at our dismissal of him, and so, having learned my lesson from ignoring them, I walked over, telling him that we were the only ones available to take care of him. He frowned and shook his head, saying that he had never let a woman, especially not a Korean, take care of him. A laughed and turned to me, grinning. "This sounds just like my friend's, a racist grandpa." We chuckled over that, rolling our eyes, but I kept watching the old man. I knew that I couldn't completely lower my guard, but A's comment did tickle me. Where we are in the middle of nowhere, I had faced quite a bit of it before, but mainly from the forgotten few who had never decided to leave the all-white town that they lived in. instead fueling their closed minds with Facebook crap and other jargon like that. A stopped laughing rather quickly when she saw the old man shuffle. I walked over to face him and saw him grasping the front of his trousers, extremely inappropriately. His voice was low, rasping, and he spoke harrowing words. I bet your grandpa was always right. He stopped abruptly once A looked at him in disgust. He took the hand that was against his trousers and tapped the screen. It sounded like Morse code, but I had no way to translate it. A yelled at him to stop it, for him to stop doing what he was doing and to leave now. The man slowly laughed, shakily on his walker, before taking one look back and saying, They scream the best, you know. Your grandpa wants you to know that. A stared at him, pure fury on her face, and then she crumpled. She didn't want to speak on it, but I knew. She had told me before how her grandmother was a comfort woman, and how if she could have survived that, A could handle this. But A couldn't. And on Blue Monday this year, she leapt off the rooftop of the hospital. I wasn't working that day, but from what H&F told me, she seemed to be at peace before she had died. She packed her favorite meal for lunch, sharing it with as many of her coworkers as she could, and then she drank a whole bottle of vodka, took off her shoes, and leapt off the building. We were allowed to go to her funeral to take time off. It was sad to see her smiling face and the portrait of the shrine that they had made. I couldn't remember the last time that I had seen her face so full of life, like it was in that picture. You might be wondering what's made me decide to come back after all this time. Why I've decided that the fear of going to a psychiatric ward for the rest of my life is culled by the desire to share my story. Well, I'm currently in the elevator to the morgue with one of them. Tonight, I was working the night shift. It was just me and F. She had asked to pardon herself for a bit and I obliged. My thrill for life wasn't so prevalent anymore. They didn't scare me anymore. And then G walked in. In case you've forgotten, G was our janitor who had died of complications during the pandemic. He was a joy to work with, always cracking up jokes and showing us pictures of his grandchildren who lived out of state. And yet here he was, walking over to me with the same warm smile on his face, a golden canine shining back at me. I teared up, I'm not afraid to admit it, and I hugged it. The thing parading his G, I hugged it, him, and it hugged me back. It patted my back and told me that he knows. I didn't know what he meant, but the thing grabbed its jaw and broke its neck. It winked at me, still the same warm smile as G had, and pointed a finger to the stretcher and then the elevator. I know I sound stupid, I know that I sound dumb, but I didn't feel threatened. So I put him on the stretcher, covered a sheet over his body. Sorry, its body. And now I'm writing this sitting in the morgue waiting for something to happen. There's a reason that we aren't supposed to be down here, to be with them, but I feel strangely fine. Safe. I'm okay. First and foremost, I'm okay. Last week was intense and hard to wrap my head around, but I'm okay. I'm free. I left you all with the information that I was slowly heading down to the morgue in the elevator, the corpse of one of them on a stretcher beside me. I admit that I had been acting impulsively, irrationally, and irresponsibly. It was strange, a feeling of incomprehensible familiarity overcame me, and I abided its request. The thing parading is G. When the doors had closed and we had begun to descend, I panicked. I began to furiously press the alarm button, realizing that whatever it was that had tricked me into the elevator with it could do to me what it had done to E, the nurse who had lost her life after being left alone with them. I had no reason to trust these monsters, no reason to believe that this one, This one that concealed itself in a flesh suit, fit to gain my empathies and to reveal my vulnerabilities, was any different to those that had traumatized myself and my coworkers, my friends, that had driven A to suicide. It sat up in the stretcher, the draw sheet still covering its head as it rose. It lifted a hand out from under the sheet, gently placing it on my wrist. And it wasn't tanned and wrinkled from sun damage as G's hand had been. It was pale, a purpled white with no fingernails. No fingernails. I had to hold myself from shrieking out in case that angered it. When a voice called through the intercom in the elevator asking if everything was alright, I had opted to stay silent. I just stared, unmoving, at the covered figure that seemed to stare back at me from under the sheet. Eventually, I had heard a crackling. Must have been one of those things again. And the intercom turned off. I'm scared. I remember whispering out, tensing at my own admission. But the thing under the sheet didn't react in the typical sadistic way that I had grown to expect from them. It paused and then, as if finally processing what I had said or what it wanted to say, it replied, I know. Its voice wasn't scratched or false, nothing akin to the imperfect sounds that had emerged from the earlier versions of its kind. It was clear and deep, masculine but with no identifiable accent. My brain scrambled to identify the familiarity to its voice, but at the time, I couldn't put my finger on it. In hindsight, the familiarity may have simply been the fact that all uncanny qualities seemed to have dissolved away. The elevator came to a stop and the doors opened to the morgue. It was cold and the smell of cleaning bleach stung my nostrils, but it did nothing to mask the undercurrent of the dank, persistent stench of mold permeating through the cracks. There was a long hallway before us, flickering lights doing nothing to settle my erratic heart rate. It was clear that there hadn't been sufficient enough maintenance down here for a while, but I had expected as much. Our superiors didn't want any of us to go down here, and I had imagined that policy extended to external maintenance employees as well. I hadn't noticed it move to stand until it had walked past me, the draw sheet covering it like a child's ghost costume. I didn't have the courage to ask it how it could see without eye holes. I noticed how the clothes that it was wearing as it disguised itself as G had instead completely disappeared, leaving a set of lean, blotched pale legs shuffling forward to the morgue door. It stopped suddenly, swinging around awkwardly as it turned to face me. Card. I need your card. I remembered how frightened I was. I had half a mind to turn around and hurriedly press the elevator buttons to leave the situation immediately. Nothing seems worse than being threatened into psychiatric confinement until you're staring into the face of the unknown, the face of possible death. Yet there was a concerning amount of fearlessness screaming out in my brain, disregarding the nerves in my quickening heart and jellied legs. So I took the risk and I moved toward it. These things weren't normal and there was no guarantee that I wouldn't die instantly had I run away from it. For some bizarre reason, I felt safer with it than I did running away. I pressed my keycard against the morgue door and pushed it open. A flurry of even cooler air poured out and the dim, stuffy atmosphere of the morgue overwhelmed my senses. Almost as quickly as the door had opened, the thing began to rush around the morgue, looking at the name tags that adorned each storage tray. It began to huff in frustration, grabbing at its sheet-covered head and slapping palms against the metal trays. Its breathing slowed and calmly it spoke. "Turn around," it ordered. "What?" "Turn around, you don't want to see." We stood, staring at each other once again. I hesitated, but once again I didn't feel threatened, and so I turned around. The slow shuffling of bare feet against the dust-ridden floor grew closer and closer until it paused, rustling slightly. The sheet was placed over my head. My mind had immediately snapped to recall execution stories that I had heard of, where people are given the small privilege of not knowing where their impending death would commence. "Please don't kill me," I begged, sobbing as I continued to face the wall, sheet covering my head and torso. There was a pause before it began to give a short, abrupt pat on my upper back. I sobbed harder, falling to my knees. I couldn't help but think of how I should have left when I had the chance, or how I should have ignored it once it came in disguised as G, or how I never should have became a nurse to begin with, or how. And then it swore, it cursed against God, like a person would have. I took off the sheet and turned around. I saw it as it actually was. It wasn't as Dr. D had described it at all. It was my height, but human. A naked, lean male physique, but without any genitalia. It didn't have a grotesquely wide smile or jagged teeth. It didn't look like a monster. It looked like something that was just as afraid as I was. Its large, black eyes widened in horror as it saw me approach, and it rushed to a corner in the shadows. I placed my palms up, showing that I meant peace, but its glossy eyes remained transfixed, on edge. "Please don't hurt me," it said. But instead of invoking pity in me, pity invoked had it been a human. It simply made me angry. "Me hurt you? You're the one that hurts us. You hurt my friends. You've tormented us for years." I was exasperated and I kicked a metal table that sat nearby. It flinched at my aggression and the metal rumbling that echoed throughout the room. A small steel scalpel rattled from the table and I lunged for it, holding it before me as I pointed it towards the thing. "You drove A to suicide. You killed a nurse." "We've never killed anyone," it said coldly. It stood up and moved in front of me, placing a warm, pale fist against the sharpness of the makeshift weapon. It didn't flinch from the contact, but a clear, viscous fluid began to drip from its palm onto the floor. I could see its malnourished and hairless skin and black eyes clearly now. It had no pigment to its irises, just dark, empty black, with the low light of the morgue reflecting back at me. "We will never sink as low as your kind." I froze. "What?" It continued to glare back at me, unmoving, intimidating. "What do you mean? Dr. D told me what you things did to that nurse, that..." "That doctor is nothing more than a liar. He hides his guilt with the drink." It responded and eyed me up as if to challenge me on its statement. I simply stared back at it, gaping like a fish as I floundered to pull the pieces of information together. "How do you know that? How long have you been watching us?" It scuttled back, continuing to search the name tags and every body tray that it hadn't seen so far. It had ignored my question. "What is it?" I asked again, desperately trying to make some sense of the situation, of my mind, anything. Eventually it stopped moving, simply tapping gingerly against the metal of a single body tray. "What does John Doe mean?" it asked, its voice no greater than a whisper. "It means that we don't know the identity of the body," I replied, and it hummed in response, high-pitched enough that it sounded like it was holding back tears. I couldn't stop myself from rambling on, aimlessly trying to fill the silence. "I don't know why we do it. I think we just believe everybody should have a name, even if it's not their actual one." It nodded slowly. "It's a shame that not all of you are this kind." And it abruptly pulled open the body tray, metal screeching against metal as the unoiled steel grated against the mechanism inside. I flinched and gasped and then began to sob. Slow, low whimpers of the throat, ready to burst from its tightly closed mouth. It wailed just as I had done a few moments ago, when I thought that I'd be killed. Except its wailing wasn't one that I had never heard before. It was that of a father wailing for its child. As a nurse, I had seen my fair share of human kids dying far before their time. There's nothing like a parent crying for their kid. It's unnatural, a haunting terror inexplicable to those who have the privilege to not know it. Children aren't supposed to die before their parents, but the world is cruel and they do. Curiosity took over me once again and I looked into the tray. I had to stifle a gag because although the sight was horrific, I was still a nurse and this thing sobbing next to me was still an individual who had lost their child. It was a smaller version of the thing, the same being that I was rubbing awkward sympathies on its back as it cried in agony. A small, hairless humanoid creature, with cloudy white eyes that hadn't been given the courtesy to be closed. The small creature had multiple puncture wounds all over its body, and despite having been dead for a while had mummified, as opposed to our human way of decaying. Its skin wasn't pale but grayed and dark, and I can only describe it as seeing something that had had the life sucked out of it, wrung dry. "I'm sorry," was all that I could muster out. I didn't really know what to say. There was a disconnect between us, the thing and I. It was my enemy but also a living and breathing entity. It continued to wail. We stayed like that for a while until it had reached into the body tray to cradle the smaller thing in its arms. They had a name. It's not a name in your language, but they had one. It said, and I just nodded in response. I was trained in dealing with grief, so I knew better than to interject. It continued to cradle its child. "We have been waiting for this, for confirmation." "I don't understand." It shook its head, and with a free hand it wiped its tears. "You have been plaguing our kind for decades. We are always youthful, but you were not." It sat down and nestled the corpse under its neck. "Human beings have always wanted to be youthful. Immortality is not as pleasing as it sounds." I shrunk to the floor, kneeling. This had been it. I had finally known what this all was, the reason, the meaning. "It's a superficial desire," it said, stroking the back of the corpse's head absent-mindedly, though whether it was to soothe the dead or itself I wasn't sure. "To try and stay youthful, to steal the qualities of other kinds to fulfill that desire. Beauty is fleeting, and to pump your kind's own skin with it just to stay youthful is." It trailed off, black eyes welling with tears once more. For a brief moment, I had sworn that I had never seen anything more human. "We simply wanted to scare you enough to make sure that you wouldn't keep coming back to hunt us." The morgue door had slammed open and multiple men in what I believe was unmarked police gear busted in, guns in the ready. They shouted at us incoherently, the crackling of radio and code filling the air. Instinctively, I put my hands up, turning to the thing as I begged it to do the same, to show that it wasn't attacking, that it was innocent. But it relented. I saw the faint smirk on its face as confirmation clouded its eyes. It knew what was coming, but it didn't care. It shot me a final glance, lipless mouth still curled into a knowing smile, and it spoke, whispered for the very last time. "This is the true nature of your kind." It didn't move despite my pleas, and a flurry of gunshots plastered its torso and face, and I shook in shock, my eyes never leaving it as the same clear, viscous fluid dripped from every wound. Its face was almost entirely caved in from the proximity of the shots. It slumped back against the body trays, and although its thin arms went limp, the body of its child, his child, was laid down gently in his lap. Everything after that is a blur. It's been over a week since it all happened. I was escorted out by the police and quickly handed a form which I signed, having not read it. Not that I really care either way. I can't get its "sorry" his face out of my mind. He wasn't scared or frightened. He was happy. He was right, and he had known exactly what would happen. He had finally been reunited with his child. I'm not really sure what else to say. B keeps calling me, asking me where I am, why I haven't come back to work. I don't have the heart to tell him. Ignorance is bliss after all, and even if I did tell him the truth, there would be more harm put in his way than there needed to be. For the past week, I've been wondering how many other of his kind were still there, locked away in the morgue. How many others would come to collect their offspring, their kin? I wondered how many of us would do the same, engage in psychological warfare if the ones we loved were being used for whatever nefarious medical practices, needed or not. My mind wandered to the war crimes committed by mankind since the dawn of time, and how many of us mindlessly conform to practices because that's what we know, all we know. I'm checking myself into a psychiatric ward. I need to be alone and cared for now. I would have never thought my career as an ER nurse would turn out this way. Maybe I was naive. Nothing can prepare you for the horrors of humanity's actions, especially when you're faced with a being who knows themselves to be just as human as you are.